Hello friends, welcome to Manga University.
Brought to you by the Tao of Otaku.
I'm Ziki.
And I'm Bill, and this is the podcast for manga and comic book creators and fans alike that want to dive deeper into the art of creating great stories.
Today we're venturing into new territory. We're venturing into the dark side, shall I say?
Dark side.
Okay, anyways, we're talking about villains today. Hopefully we didn't get too carried away with our semantics, but we're talking about villains today. We've been doing a series of episodes about characters. We've spoken about protagonists, so your heroes, if you like, secondary characters, so your hero's friends and maybe some of his enemies. And now we're looking at villains, essentially the antithesis to your hero, their main. But as with all of our episodes in this series, we've been essentially trying to define what we mean by these terms. We know you guys probably have an idea of what they mean, but it's best to come up with some common ground and then go from there. So Bill, over to you.
Oh, hectic, hot seat. I would say that your villain slash antagonist is someone who either has a goal that is counter to the main characters, or their goal is counter to the flow of the world.
And therefore counter to the main characters.
Oh, and therefore counter the main character.
Because I think that's one thing that a lot of people miss. Sorry to just jump in here. Is oftentimes you have an antagonist who can destroy millions of universes, but it doesn't have an impact unless we see the hero and the specific people he wants to protect. Obviously, he wants to stop the antagonist, to stop him from destroying the world, but really what's giving him strength are the people who he wants to protect. And it's that smaller dynamic that actually makes all the difference. Just something I wanted to point out.
And more so with the first example that I gave with counter to the main character's goals, which doesn't necessarily mean being a bad guy. Because in the Death Note manga, Death Note, one of the titles that we've spoken about before, the antagonist there is a character known as L. And L is actually, by all definitions, the good guy in the story. His moral code is closer to, well, we hope is closer to the readers, closer to the justice system that is implemented in the show and in our world, where Kira, the main character, the protagonist, is trying to kill off as many criminals as he can, which, although in his own twisted way is just, it's against the will of the world. And in that sense, it makes L the protagonist, even though, by definition, the roles are reversed.
All right, I'm glad you brought up the example of light because I think it really illustrates the spectrum that we have when constructing the dynamic between your hero and your villain, or your protagonist and your antagonist. So, in the case of Death Note, what you have is a very thin line that separates the antagonist from the villain. In other words, when you watch Death Note, it's very difficult to say who is the true hero of this story, because we take Light, for example. He's the central character through which we perceive this world. So we immediately identify with him, and his intentions are very good. He's coming from a good place, but the way he executes his ambitions are very questionable and inflicts a lot of suffering and misery upon people. And L is trying to stop him. And in many ways, Light is making the world a better place. It's just the means don't necessarily justify the ends. But because he's making the world a better place and L is trying to stop him, that creates a villainous nature to L, even though he's also operating from a place that he feels is morally just. And it's almost impossible to separate who's really the protagonist, or not necessarily who's really the protagonist, but who's the hero and the villain. Light is definitely the protagonist, but he's not necessarily the villain. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you can have a much clearer demarcation between hero and villain. A classic example is in comics, where you have Superman and Lex Luthor. Superman is, they call him the Boy Scout. He is good by all reasonable definition. Although there are variations of this, typically Superman is good, and he operates through or subject to a very strict moral code, whereas Lex Luthor is evil. He might not necessarily think that he's evil, but the means through which he tries to achieve his goals inflict suffering and misery upon the world. It goes against the will of the world, as you mentioned, Bill. And so with Superman and Lex Luthor, you have a very clear distinction between who is hero and who is villain, and that's on the other end of the spectrum.